In the winter of 1944, something happened in the Italian Alps, something that will leave everyone who hears this story frozen in disbelief. Soldiers climbing vertical cliffs in -20 degrees, knee-deep in snow, weapons in their hands, 40-pound packs on their backs, and an unquenchable fire in their hearts. These soldiers were no ordinary men. They were British and American mountain warriors, and that night they would achieve the impossible. If you're new to this channel, don't miss the most striking stories of World War II, because the story I'm about to tell you is the kind you won't find in textbooks. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, subscribe and hit the like button. Let's continue. Now close your eyes and imagine yourself at the top of those mountains. The wind cuts your face, your fingers are about to freeze. One wrong step and you'll tumble hundreds of meters down. And on top of all that, you could come under enemy fire at any moment. This is exactly what British and American soldiers experienced, but they didn't back down, because freedom was worth every sacrifice. The Italian front was one of the most challenging battlefields of World War II. The Allies had landed in Sicily in the south and begun their conquest of Italy from the north. But Italy's geography turned the war into a nightmare. Mountains, rivers, narrow valleys, everything favored the defender, and the Germans exploited this advantage to the fullest. The defense system called the Gothic Line nearly split Italy in half. This line ran through the most rugged sections of the Alps and seemed impossible to breach. But the word impossible didn't exist in the vocabulary of British and American soldiers. When we talk about Alpine warfare, what comes to mind? Maybe snow, maybe cold, maybe high peaks. But the reality was far more brutal. This was a battlefield where human will and endurance were pushed to their limits. Think about it. Fighting the enemy in a normal military operation is hard enough, but add the battle against nature on top of that. Avalanche danger, freezing cold, oxygen deprivation, slippery rocks. Just surviving in these conditions was a victory in itself. But British and American soldiers didn't just survive, they won. When the landing in Italy took place in 1943, Allied commanders thought it would be a quick victory. Rome would fall within a few months, the Germans would retreat north, and Italy would be liberated. But reality was very different. The Germans fought for every inch of ground. The Battle of Cassino, the Anzio landing, the Gothic Line. Each one was its own hell, and British and American soldiers faced that hell head-on. To understand how different mountain warfare is, let me give you some numbers. A normal infantry division can advance about 30 kilometers per day. In mountainous terrain, that number drops to 5 kilometers. Sometimes it takes days or even weeks to capture a single kilometer. Every hill is like a fortress, every valley is a trap, and every step is an appointment with death. The Alpine experience of the British Army actually dated back years. British units that fought against the Austro-Hungarian Empire on the Italian front in World War I had learned how challenging Alpine conditions could be. But the Alpine warfare of World War II overshadowed even those previous experiences, because this time the enemy was more determined, the weapons were more deadly, and the war was more ruthless. The American Army brought a different perspective to mountain warfare. The 10th Mountain Division was an elite unit specifically trained for this type of combat. It consisted of soldiers who had trained in Colorado's Rocky Mountains and specialized in skiing and climbing. These soldiers knew that the mountain could be both your friend and your enemy, and they used that knowledge to the fullest in Italy.
Now let me tell you a story. In February 1945, the American 10th Mountain Division received orders to attack Riva Ridge. Riva Ridge was a critical point of the Gothic Line. Advancing without capturing this ridge was impossible. But here was the problem. Riva Ridge consisted of nearly vertical cliffs. The Germans thought an attack here was impossible, and that thought was their biggest mistake. American soldiers moved under the cover of darkness. They had ropes, climbing equipment, and weapons in their hands. Silently, Step by step, they began climbing the cliffs. One mistake, one slip, one sound could ruin everything, but these soldiers were too determined to risk any error. They climbed for hours, muscles straining, gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, and by dawn they were at the summit. By the time the Germans woke up and realized what had happened, they were already surrounded. Riva Ridge had fallen. This success wasn't just a military victory, it was a triumph of the human spirit. These soldiers had overcome every obstacle that nature and the enemy could throw at them, and in doing so, they had written their names in history in golden letters. British soldiers also displayed unforgettable heroism in the Alpine War. The Gurkha units and British Commandos in particular achieved extraordinary success in mountain warfare. These soldiers would infiltrate enemy lines at night, capture strategic positions, and withdraw, silent and deadly. The Germans feared them so much that even the sound of a Gurkha knife was enough to crush morale. A British commander once said, "Fighting in the mountains is like playing chess. Every move must be calculated. One wrong step and you lose the game." But our soldiers were the best chess players, and they won every time. These words perfectly summarize the nature of Alpine warfare. This war didn't require just physical strength. Strategy, patience, and intelligence were also necessary, and British and American soldiers possessed all of these qualities. Another challenging aspect of warfare in the mountains was logistics. Transporting heavy weapons, ammunition, and supplies to the mountaintops was nearly impossible. Trucks were useless because there were no roads. Horses and mules were used, but they could only carry limited loads. Most of the time, soldiers had to carry their own equipment on their backs, and while doing so, they were under enemy fire. But despite all these difficulties, British and American soldiers never gave up. They were fighting for an ideal, for freedom, against tyranny, and that ideal gave them the strength to overcome even mountains. The Gothic Line was the Germans' last major defensive line in Italy. Breaking through this line meant the liberation of Italy, and British and American soldiers worked with all their might to break through this line. Some lost their lives, some were wounded, but none of them gave up, because they were ready to pay the price of freedom. In the rest of this video, I'll tell you about the most critical moments of the Alpine War. What tactics were used? Which weapons were effective? How did soldiers cope with the cold? All these questions will be answered in Part 2. But I can tell you this story is one of the most striking examples of what heroism truly means. And these heroes were British and American soldiers. If this story interested you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Your likes help more people discover these stories, and the story of these heroes is definitely one that everyone should hear. Are you ready to move on to Part 2? Because the real adventure is just beginning. Let's go! Welcome back to Part 2. We're continuing without slowing down. In Part 1, I told you how brutal the Alpine War was. I explained how Riva Ridge was captured, but now we're going much deeper. In this episode, you'll learn all the details of mountain warfare. What tactics were used? How did soldiers survive in -20 degrees? How did weapons function in the freezing cold? And most importantly, what did these heroes go through? If you're ready, we're embarking on a journey into the heart of ice and fire. If you're watching this video and haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time, because on this channel, we tell history's most unforgettable stories, and you don't want to miss them. If you've subscribed and liked the video, let's continue. Thank you. To understand the Alpine War, you first need to understand Italy's geography. Italy is a peninsula stretching from north to south.
and running right through the middle of this peninsula are the Apennine Mountains. These mountains nearly divide the country in two, the Ligurian Sea to the west, the Adriatic Sea to the east, and between these two seas lies an extremely difficult mountain range to cross. The Germans used this geography like a shield. The Gothic Line ran through the steepest points of these mountains, and breaking through this line was one of the greatest challenges for the Allies. The Gothic Line wasn't a simple defensive position. The Germans had built it over months. Concrete bunkers, minefields, barbed wire, machine gun nests. Every hill had been turned into a fortress. Every valley was designed as a killing field. And when all of this combined with the mountain's natural defenses, it created an impenetrable barrier. At least that's what the Germans thought. But British and American commanders thought differently. They knew that what seemed impossible was actually just difficult, and difficult didn't scare them. Now let me tell you about the tactics used in mountain warfare. In a normal battle, there's a concept of a front line. Two armies face each other and try to push one another back. But in the mountains, this tactic doesn't work, because in the mountains, there's no flat front line. Hills, valleys, cliffs, everything is three-dimensional. That's why mountain warfare requires different tactics. British and American forces masterfully employed infiltration tactics. This involved slipping through weak points in enemy lines and attacking from behind. Small units moved under the cover of night, silently passing enemy positions to reach strategic points. This tactic provided the advantage of surprise and also demoralized the enemy, because the Germans knew they could be attacked from anywhere at any moment. The American 10th Mountain Division was one of the best practitioners of these tactics. This division was specifically formed for mountain warfare. Most of its soldiers were skiers, mountaineers, or foresters in civilian life. They knew the mountains, they respected the mountains, and they knew how to use the mountains to their advantage. One American soldier wrote in his journal, "The mountains became our friend. The Germans couldn't see us because we were part of the mountain. We moved among the rocks, advanced beneath the snow, crawled in the darkness of night, and by the time they noticed us, it was too late." These words reflected the essence of mountain warfare. Success depended not just on firepower, but on moving in harmony with the environment. British forces brought their own expertise to the Alpine War. The British Commandos were renowned for their courage and skill. These soldiers took on the most difficult missions, infiltrating behind enemy lines, blowing up bridges, cutting communication lines, and usually they did all of this at night. One British commando operation is particularly noteworthy. In the autumn of 1944, a group of British commandos was tasked with destroying a German communications center. This center had been set up in a monastery at the top of the mountains. Reaching it seemed nearly impossible. The only way was to climb vertical cliffs, but the British commandos accepted the mission. They moved out at midnight. With their faces painted black, explosives and weapons on their backs, they scaled the cliffs. After hours of climbing, they reached the monastery. They silently neutralized the guards and blew up the communications center. Then they descended the same cliffs and disappeared into the darkness. While the Germans were trying to figure out what happened, the British commandos were already safe. This operation showed that mountain warfare required more than just courage, planning, preparation, and flawless execution. The British commandos excelled at all of these. Gurkha units also played a legendary role in the Alpine War. These warriors from Nepal had grown up in the mountains. They were people who lived in the foothills of the Himalayas and were accustomed to high altitude. They were also known for their legendary courage and loyalty. The Gurkhas' most famous weapon was the kukri knife. This curved blade was both a tool and a deadly weapon, and the Gurkhas' skill with the kukri struck fear into the enemy. A note was found in a German officer's journal. Night watch is the most terrifying duty because you never know if the Gurkhas are coming. You only hear the click of that knife, and by then, it's already too late. This psychological impact was one of the Gurkhas' greatest advantages. The Germans were so afraid of them that morale was constantly low in areas where Gurkha units were present, and a soldier with low morale has already lost half the battle. Now let's talk about perhaps the most challenging aspect of mountain warfare: weather conditions. Winter in the Italian Alps is merciless. Temperatures drop to -20 degrees. Snowstorms can last for days, and fighting in these conditions pushes the human body and spirit to their absolute limits. Cold is a silent killer. In freezing temperatures, maintaining body heat is extremely difficult. Hands and feet first go numb, then start to hurt and eventually feel nothing. This is the beginning of frostbite, and if untreated, frostbite can lead to permanent damage or even amputation. British and American soldiers developed various methods to combat the cold. Layered clothing was the most important strategy. The inner layer should wick away sweat, the middle layer should insulate, and the outer layer should be wind and waterproof. But in combat conditions, achieving this ideal wasn't always possible. Supply convoys came under enemy fire, supply lines were cut, and soldiers had to make do with what they had. A letter from an American soldier describes this hardship vividly. "Mom, sleeping here every night is an adventure. Our tent sways in the wind, our blankets freeze, our breath turns to steam. When I wake up in the morning, I can't feel my fingertips, but I think that this price is worth paying for freedom, and one day when I come home, I'll tell this story to my grandchildren." This letter shows not just the physical endurance of American soldiers, but their spiritual strength. They knew why they were fighting, and this awareness gave them the strength to carry on even in the darkest moments. Weapons were also affected by the cold. When metal parts freeze, they expand or contract. This can cause weapons to jam. Lubricants freeze, mechanisms slow down. A weapon failing to fire in mountain warfare could mean death. Soldiers developed various techniques to solve this problem: warming weapons with body heat, using special cold weather lubricants, wrapping metal parts in cloth. Each unit found its own methods, and as experiences were shared, everyone improved. British Army supply officers did an extraordinary job in this regard. They did everything they could to get cold weather equipment to the front lines: special gloves, heated boots, face masks. This equipment played a critical role in maintaining the soldiers' combat capability. In Alpine warfare, logistics was perhaps one of the greatest challenges. There are no roads in the mountains. Trucks and tanks are useless. Everything has to be carried on human or animal backs, and this transportation had to be done under enemy fire. Mule and horse units were invaluable for this reason. These animals were more reliable than machines for carrying loads. They could navigate narrow paths and climb steep slopes, but they had their limits too. Other solutions were needed for heavy artillery and ammunition. American engineers found creative solutions to this problem. They set up cable car systems to haul materials up. Helicopters weren't widespread yet, but small aircraft were used for some deliveries. And sometimes the most primitive method was the most effective: human power. Soldiers carried enormous loads on their backs to reach the summits. An American lieutenant's report stated, "Today we carried artillery up the mountain. 6 men climbed for 3 hours carrying parts of a gun on their backs. By the time we reached the summit, we were all exhausted, but we assembled the gun and opened fire on the enemy. At that moment, all the fatigue was worth it." British units also mastered logistics. The Royal Logistics Corps maintained the flow of supplies even in the most difficult conditions: hot meals, dry clothes, and fresh ammunition. These were vital for maintaining soldiers' morale and combat capability. The Battle of Mount Belvedere was one of the critical turning points of the Alpine War. This mountain was one of the strongest fortresses of the Gothic Line. The Germans had been fortifying it for years. Concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, minefields, everything was optimized for defense. The American 10th Mountain Division was tasked with taking Mount Belvedere, and this mission would be the division's toughest test. The attack began in February. Weather conditions were terrible. A snowstorm had reduced visibility to nearly zero. But this bad weather was also an advantage. The Germans weren't expecting an attack. Who would attack in this hellish weather?
The American soldiers attacked. At midnight, simultaneous attacks began from multiple points. Soldiers advanced through the snowstorm. Visibility was so poor that sometimes they couldn't even see their own men. But they pressed forward with compasses and instinct, and before dawn, they reached the first defensive lines. The battle was bloody. The Germans fought desperately to hold their positions. Machine guns spewed fire. Grenades flew through the air. American soldiers advanced bunker by bunker, position by position. Every meter gained was paid for in blood. But the Americans didn't give up. After hours of fighting, the summit of Mount Belvedere came under American control. The German garrison was defeated, and one of the most important fortresses of the Gothic Line had fallen. This victory showed the world how capable the American 10th Mountain Division was, and, more importantly, it proved that the Germans were not invincible. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. British units also won their own victories. The operations of the 8th Army in particular played a critical role in the collapse of the Gothic Line. British commanders organized masterful deception operations to mislead the enemy. Fake radio traffic, dummy tanks, false intelligence. The Germans couldn't figure out which direction the attack would come from, and when the real attack came, they were caught unprepared. The British offensive starting from the Adriatic coast shattered the German defense. Unit by unit, hill by hill, they advanced, and with each passing day, the Gothic Line grew weaker. A British general's words went into history. "Taking mountains is difficult, but not impossible. Our soldiers made the impossible possible, and this victory is a monument to their courage and sacrifice." Medical services also faced great difficulties in the Alpine War. Evacuating the wounded was an extremely challenging task in mountainous terrain. Stretchers had to be carried on narrow paths, sometimes the wounded had to be brought down on backs, and all of this was done under enemy fire. Medics were the unsung heroes of this war. They went to the front lines unarmed, collected the wounded, and brought them back. Many lost their lives performing this duty, but thanks to their sacrifice, countless soldiers were saved. One American medic's story is particularly moving. This 22-year-old young man had single-handedly carried 12 wounded soldiers in one day. Under enemy fire, in the middle of a snowstorm, he worked until he collapsed from exhaustion. Finally, he himself collapsed, and his comrades rescued him. This young medic later received a Bronze Star Medal. But for him, the real reward was that the soldiers he saved survived. British medical teams also delivered an extraordinary performance. Mobile hospitals were established, forward surgical teams were formed, and medical care was provided even in the most difficult conditions. Thanks to these services, many wounded soldiers recovered and some even returned to the front. The psychological dimension of the Alpine War should not be overlooked. Living under constant danger, extreme fatigue, the loss of friends, these things strained the soldiers' mental health. A condition called combat fatigue affected many soldiers, but the morale officers and chaplains of the British and American armies worked to keep the soldiers' spirits high. Letters were delivered home, small celebrations were organized, unit cohesion was strengthened. These efforts helped soldiers endure the hardships. The words of a British sergeant summarized this beautifully.
Some nights we fell into despair. Cold, fatigue, fear, they all came crashing down on us at once. But then we would look at our comrades. They were going through the same things, and as long as we were together, we knew we could overcome anything. This sense of unity was the greatest strength of British and American forces. They weren't just soldiers, they were brothers, and brothers never leave each other behind. The collapse of the Gothic Line didn't end the war in Italy, but it was the beginning of the end. The Germans began retreating north. As the Allies advanced, Italian cities were liberated one by one, and in every liberated city, the people poured into the streets to cheer the Allied soldiers. Those cheers made all the sacrifices worthwhile. British and American soldiers had fought for freedom and won, and the Italian people would never forget it. Subscribe and like the video for this valuable story. In this episode, we covered the details of the Alpine War, tactics, challenges, victories. But the story isn't over. In the third and final episode, I'll tell you how this war ended and what our heroes went through. I'll also share a very special story with you. This story will deeply move you. Are you ready? Because the final episode will be unforgettable. Let's continue. Welcome to the final episode. We're continuing without stopping. In the first 2 episodes, I told you how brutal the Alpine War was. You saw the mercilessness of the mountains, the burning cold, the determination of the enemy. You met soldiers waiting in trenches during freezing nights, commandos climbing vertical cliffs, units advancing through snowstorms. But now we're coming to the most important part of the story. In this episode, I'll tell you how the war ended, what our heroes went through, and why this war still matters today. I promise you, by the end of this episode, you'll see some things very differently. Because this story isn't just a war story. This is a story of the triumph of the human spirit. If you've watched this video all the way here, you're truly someone interested in history. And on this channel, we create content specifically for you. We bring to light stories you won't find in textbooks or see in documentaries. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. Subscribe, like, and don't miss the next video, because we have many more stories to tell. The spring of 1945 brought winds of hope to Italy. The Gothic Line had been shattered, German forces were retreating northward, and British and American units were beginning to smell victory. After months of merciless fighting, light was finally visible. But the war wasn't over yet. Although the Germans were retreating, they continued to fight. The struggle continued for every village, every town, every mountain pass. Accepting defeat was unthinkable for German commanders, so they resisted until their last breath. In April, the Po Valley was reached. This wide plain stretched south of the Alps and contained Italy's most fertile farmland. For centuries, this land had been Italy's breadbasket, but now this valley would host the final stage of the war. For the Germans, this valley was the last line of defense. If the Po Valley fell, the road to Germany would be open, the Alps would be crossed, and the heart of the Third Reich would be under threat. That's why fierce battles took place here. Blood was shed for every inch of land. The British 8th Army advanced from the east, the American 5th Army from the west. These 2 armies squeezed the German forces like a pincer. This coordinated movement was a demonstration of Allied commanders' mastery. These 2 armies, having fought together for years, now operated like a single machine, and German commanders were beginning to realize the situation was hopeless. The escape route was closing. Surrender or be destroyed. There was no other option. But desperation made the Germans more dangerous. Like a cornered animal, they fought to their last breath. They launched kamikaze attacks. They employed ambush tactics. They set up suicide defenses. They tried everything. They seemed insane. They had nothing left to lose, and this made them unpredictable. But British and American soldiers broke this final resistance too. They advanced with patience, determination, and courage. The enemy's desperation couldn't stop them. An American captain's journal contained these lines: "Today we took 3 villages. In each one the Germans fought to their last bullet. Some refused to surrender and died where they stood. We have casualties, but we're advancing, a little more each day. I can see the end now. This nightmare is ending, and we're winning. Going home is no longer a dream." These lines perfectly reflect the atmosphere of those days. There was fatigue, there was the pain of loss, but there was also hope. Victory was no longer far away, and this hope gave the soldiers one final burst of strength. They had a job to finish, and they would finish it. British units advanced with the same determination. British forces advancing toward Venice took special precautions to capture the historic city undamaged. Venice was one of humanity's most valuable cultural heritages. Centuries-old palaces, churches, bridges, St. Mark's Square, the Rialto Bridge, countless works of art. All of these had to be protected from the war's destruction, and British commanders were determined to preserve this heritage. They avoided using heavy weapons. They didn't request air bombardment. Instead of besieging the city, they pressed diplomatic channels. Fortunately, the Germans abandoned Venice without defending it. Perhaps they too couldn't bring themselves to destroy such beauty. Or perhaps they simply wanted to escape. Whatever the reason, the city was liberated without a single shot being fired. And the Venetians welcomed the British soldiers with tears. People who had lived under oppression for years were finally free. They poured into the streets, sang songs, and danced. Joy that had been suppressed for so long overflowed. Like a flood. A British soldier's letter described this moment. "When we entered Venice, people poured into the streets. Women were crying. Men were hugging us. Children were running around us. Hundreds of hands reached out to us. Hundreds of voices thanked us. An elderly woman held my hands and said something to me in Italian. I didn't understand, but I understood what she meant from her eyes. She was thanking me. Tears streamed from her eyes, and my eyes welled up too. At that moment, I felt that everything we'd been through was worth it. All those cold nights, all those losses, all that pain, it was all worth it for this moment." These kinds of moments revealed the true meaning of the war. British and American soldiers weren't just fighting to gain territory, they were fighting to liberate people. And every person freed was a victory in this war. Numbers and maps didn't matter. What mattered was the gratitude in that elderly woman's eyes. What mattered was the smile on the children's faces. The American 10th Mountain Division also achieved extraordinary successes in the final days. In the mountains around Lake Garda, they cleared the last remnants of German resistance. This lake was Italy's largest, and its surroundings were covered with steep mountains. The Germans had taken refuge in this natural fortress, but the 10th Mountain Division didn't leave them in peace there either. These operations were the final and most brilliant demonstration of the division's mastery in mountain warfare. One operation is particularly noteworthy and has been told for many years. To capture a mountain village where German units were hiding, American soldiers moved out in the darkness of night. The village was in an almost unreachable position on top of steep cliffs. Only one path led to the village, and this path was watched by German sentries. A normal attack would result in heavy casualties. The Germans thought this place was safe. Who could climb these cliffs? But the soldiers of the 10th Mountain Division accomplished the impossible once again. Instead of using the path, they climbed directly up the cliffs. In the darkness, silently, step by step, they ascended. They used ropes and hooks. Each soldier was responsible for the life of the one behind him. One mistake could cause a chain reaction disaster. But they made no mistakes. They reached the village before dawn and caught the Germans sleeping. Without firing a single shot, 50 German soldiers were taken prisoner. This operation was a perfect combination of courage and skill, and it showed how sharp these soldiers still were even in the final days of the war. May 2, 1945. This date marks when the war in Italy officially ended. German forces surrendered unconditionally. The guns fell silent, cannons were abandoned, white flags waved, and British and American soldiers could finally celebrate victory. After years of war, peace had come, but this peace had been purchased at a heavy price. The celebrations didn't make people forget the pain of losses. They never would. Thousands of British and American soldiers had lost their lives in the Alpine War. Thousands more were wounded. Some had lost arms, legs, or eyes, and even the survivors would carry the scars of war for life. Nightmares, flinching at sudden sounds, memories of lost friends. Even though the war was over, the war would continue in their souls. The American 10th Mountain Division lost over 900 soldiers in the Italian campaign. Over 4,000 soldiers were wounded. These numbers represented a significant portion of the division's total strength, and behind every number was a human being, a son, a brother, a father, a friend. Every loss was the devastation of a family. Every wounded soldier was the beginning of a lifelong struggle. British casualties were also heavy. The Eighth Army lost tens of thousands of soldiers throughout the Italian campaign. Young men had come to this front from every corner of England, from every town, from every city, and many never returned home. These losses opened deep wounds in British society. Nearly every family had someone who had fought or died in Italy. Even after the war ended, this pain would be felt for generations. But these sacrifices were not in vain, never in vain. Italy was liberated. Fascism was defeated. Mussolini's dream turned into a nightmare, and that nightmare ended. The foundations of peace were laid in Europe. A new world order was being established, and this order would be based on freedom, not tyranny. Every drop of blood shed by British and American soldiers had watered the tree of liberty, and that tree still bears fruit today. Now I want to tell you a very special story. This story best reflects the spirit of the Alpine War, and this story deeply affected me. I hope it affects you too. His name was Thomas Edward Richardson. He was a 23-year-old British soldier. He came from a small town in the east of London, from Essex. Before the war, he worked in a bakery with his father. He would get up at 4 o'clock every morning. He would knead dough, bake bread, joke with customers. Everyone in the small town knew him. He was a cheerful, hard-working, honest young man. His life was calm and happy. He had a sweetheart, and they were planning to get married. The future looked bright. But the war changed everything. Hitler's armies were ravaging Europe. England was under threat, and Thomas joined the army to defend his country. He promised his sweetheart he would return. He hugged his father and swore he would make him proud, and he boarded a train heading into the unknown. Basic training was tough, but Thomas was resilient. Working in the bakery had made him strong. He was used to getting up at the crack of dawn. He wasn't deterred by physical challenges. He successfully completed his training and was sent to Italy, and he found himself in the middle of the Alps, facing the toughest test of his life. When he arrived in Italy, he encountered a reality very different from what he had imagined. The sunny Italy of postcards didn't exist. There was only snow, ice, rock, and death. On his first night in the trench, he waited for morning, shivering from the cold. He couldn't sleep. An attack could come at any moment. And this tension continued for days, weeks, months. In Thomas's unit, there was a soldier named James. James also came from the north of England, from Yorkshire. The two young men had been together since training camp. They had eaten together, laughed together, been afraid together. They had written letters together, missed home together. In the middle of the war, they had become each other's family. James would show Thomas photos of his sister. Thomas would tell James about his sweetheart. When the war was over, they would visit each other. They made plans. They dreamed dreams. But war doesn't care about plans. Thomas's unit was assigned to an operation targeting the Gothic Line. The objective was to capture a strategic mountain pass. This pass was critical for German supply lines. If captured, the enemy's logistics would be paralyzed. The operation was dangerous, but necessary. The attack began at night. Thomas and James advanced side by side. In the darkness, silently, they approached enemy positions. With each step, their heartbeats quickened. And then, all hell broke loose. The Germans had spotted them. Machine guns opened fire. Flares turned night into day. Chaos was everywhere. Thomas threw himself to the ground. Bullets whizzed over his head. He looked beside him, searching for James, and he saw him. James was lying on the ground, motionless. A bullet had hit his chest. Thomas crawled toward him. He held James's hand, but James's eyes were staring into emptiness. He was gone. The young man from Yorkshire had taken his last breath in the mountains of Italy. Thomas doesn't remember how he survived that night. Somehow he retreated, somehow he survived, but something inside him died. Along with James, a part of Thomas was also buried in those mountains. The operation was successful, the pass was captured, but for Thomas, nothing mattered anymore. He didn't speak for days, he didn't eat, didn't drink. His commanders wanted to send him back, but Thomas refused. He would avenge James. He would finish this war. James's death would not be in vain. And Thomas continued to fight. He was at the front line in every battle. He no longer felt fear, or he didn't care if he did. He advanced like a war machine. And one day, he encountered a moment that would change his fate. During an operation, Thomas's unit was ambushed. German machine guns were firing from all directions. The unit was trapped in a small valley. Steep cliffs on the right, steep cliffs on the left. Advancing was impossible. Retreating, too. It was a complete death trap. Soldiers were frantically seeking cover. The groans of the wounded, the whistling of bullets, the shouts of commanders. Chaos reigned. At that moment, Thomas noticed something. On the left side, between the rocks, there was a small passage, a dark, narrow, almost invisible gap. This passage could make it possible to reach behind the enemy position, but to get there, you had to run 30 meters across open ground, and open ground meant death. Every second, dozens of bullets swept that area. Thomas looked around him. His friends were dying. If nothing was done, they would all stay there, like James. And Thomas made a decision. He didn't even think. He grabbed his rifle and started running. 30 meters, a straight run, in the middle of the fire. Bullets whizzed around him. They pierced through earth, stones, air. One grazed his arm. A wave of pain spread, but he didn't stop. Another passed by his leg, tore his trousers, but he didn't stop. He ran, and miraculously reached the passage. The passage was narrow, dark, frightening, but Thomas plunged in without hesitation. He advanced between the rocks, climbed, crawled his way forward. Minutes felt like hours, and finally he reached behind the enemy position. 3 German soldiers were there, at the machine gun. They hadn't noticed until they saw Thomas. Thomas raised his rifle and fired. 3 Germans fell to the ground. Then he threw a grenade into the machine gun nest. The explosion deafened his ears. A cloud of dust rose, but the fire had stopped. This heroic action saved the entire unit. The other German soldiers in the ambush panicked and fled when they saw the attack coming from behind. The defense had collapsed, and Thomas's unit escaped without further casualties. Or rather, thanks to Thomas's action, no more casualties were taken. Thomas Richardson was recommended for the Military Cross for this courage. It was one of the war's most prestigious medals. But for Thomas, the medal didn't matter. What mattered was that he had saved his friends. He couldn't save James, but he had saved the others. And maybe, just maybe, this would console James's soul a little. After the war, Thomas returned to his hometown, to the small town in Essex, to his father's bakery. He married his sweetheart. They had children. He continued to get up at 4 o'clock every morning. He baked bread, joked with customers. From the outside, he was the same Thomas from before the war. But those who looked closely could see the difference. There was a sadness in his eyes, a shadow that never passed. Some nights he would wake from nightmares. Some days he would sink into silence. And every morning when he went to work, he carried a small photograph in his pocket. James's photograph. He never forgot his friend from Yorkshire. Every year on the anniversary of the day James died, he would go to church and pray for him. Thomas Richardson passed away in 2003 at the age of 91. Hundreds of people attended his funeral. His family, his friends, the townspeople who had grown up on his bread. And in his pocket, that photograph was still there. James's photograph. He had never been without it for 60 years. Thomas's story is just one of thousands from the Alpine War. But this story shows what was at stake in that war and how brave the soldiers were. Ordinary people did extraordinary things. Bakers, farmers, teachers, workers, they all took up arms and fought for freedom. And this extraordinariness changed the course of history. On the American side, there are also countless stories of heroism. An American soldier named John McGrath especially deserves to be remembered. McGrath single-handedly attacked a German position, enabling his unit to advance. In the middle of enemy fire, he sacrificed himself to protect his friends. He lost his life in this attack, but thanks to his courage, the operation succeeded and dozens of American soldiers were saved. McGrath was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. This is the highest honor America can give a soldier, and McGrath had fully earned this honor. These stories teach us something very important. Heroism isn't about having superpowers. Heroism isn't about being invincible like in the movies. Heroism is doing the right thing despite fear. Thomas Richardson was afraid. John McGrath was afraid. They were all afraid, but fear didn't paralyze them, didn't stop them. They conquered their fears and took action. This is the definition of true courage. The legacy of the Alpine War isn't limited to military victories. This war taught the British and American armies invaluable lessons. Mountain warfare doctrine was developed and modernized. Special cold weather equipment was designed. High-altitude medicine advanced. Mountaineering techniques were integrated into military training. And most importantly, this experience was passed on to future generations. Today, British and American special forces still apply lessons learned on the mountain fronts of World War II. The American 10th Mountain Division veterans left an unexpected legacy after the war. Many of these soldiers became pioneers of the ski industry after returning to civilian life. They had learned to fight in the mountains. Now they would teach people to have fun in the mountains. World-famous ski resorts like Aspen, Vail, Alta, and Sugarbush were founded or developed by 10th Mountain Division veterans. They transformed the mountain skills they learned in war into tourism and sport in peacetime. This transformation shows the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Creativity was born from the destruction of war. Life sprang from the shadow of death. And today, millions of people ski on the legacy of those soldiers. Perhaps while skiing, they don't think about what stories lie beneath that snow. But now you know. On the British side, the war experience also left lasting marks. The British Army's mountain warfare capability was shaped by the Italian experience. Training programs were updated, new techniques were developed, and this accumulated knowledge was passed on to the next generation of soldiers. From the Falklands War to Afghanistan, British soldiers fought in challenging terrains, and every time, lessons learned on the mountain fronts of World War II proved useful. Additionally, British-Italian friendship blossomed after the war. The Italian people never forgot the British soldiers they saw as liberators. Even today in northern Italy, in small towns and villages, there are monuments to British soldiers. Every year, ceremonies are held, flowers are laid, prayers are said. This friendship is a light born from the darkness of war, and it still shines. While telling this story, I want to emphasize something. War should never be glorified. War is pain, loss, destruction. But sometimes war becomes unavoidable. Sometimes you have to take up arms to stand against tyranny. And in those moments, ordinary people do extraordinary things. We should remember and respect this extraordinariness. Understanding the Alpine War is also important for understanding today's world. Lessons learned in that war are still valid in modern military operations. Logistics planning, climate adaptation, psychological resilience, unit cohesion. All of these were tested and developed in the mountains of Italy 80 years ago. History is the map of the future, and those who know how to read this map are better prepared for what's to come. What do you think about this? Write your thoughts in the comments. These stories also remind us of the price of freedom. The freedoms we have today didn't come free. They exist because of those soldiers' sacrifice. Every time we go to the ballot box, every time we freely express our thoughts, every time we wake up without fear, we owe those soldiers our thanks. And the best way to repay this debt is to remember and tell their stories. Almost 80 years have passed since the end of the war. Most of the soldiers who fought in that era are no longer with us. Thomas Richardson is gone. John McGrath is gone. Thousands are gone, but their stories live on, and telling these stories is the best way to keep their memory alive. A British veteran said this in an interview in the final years of his life. "It's very hard to describe what we experienced in the war. Words aren't enough. Fear, cold, pain, loss. Those who haven't experienced it can't understand. But I know one thing. Those who died there died so that we could live freely, and we who survived are obligated to carry their memory. To forget would be the greatest betrayal of them." These words are perhaps the best summary of the Alpine War: sacrifice, heroism, and risking everything for a cause. British and American soldiers did this. In the midst of ice and fire, they defended humanity's best values, and the world became a better place because of them. In this video series, I've told you the story of the Alpine War. You've seen the challenge of the mountains, the courage of the soldiers, the price of victory. You met Thomas Richardson. You heard about John McGrath. You imagined thousands of nameless heroes. I hope this story has affected you, because this story shows the best of humanity. But history is full of thousands of stories waiting to be told. There are many more unknown heroes of World War II, operations that remained in darkness, forgotten victories, silent sacrifices. And on this channel, we'll continue to tell those stories. In our next video, we'll tell you about perhaps one of the most mysterious operations of World War II. This operation was so secret that no one knew about it for decades. The files were sealed, witnesses were silenced, and the soldiers who took part in this operation took risks you can't even imagine. Let me give you a hint. This story takes place in the depths of the sea. Silent heroes in dark waters. They came unseen, they left unseen, and they left history behind them. I won't say more. keep your curiosity alive. Are you curious? I'm sure you are. Then definitely don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because the next video will be released very soon, and you don't want to miss it. Thank you so much for watching this video. If this video made you feel something, please hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and send this video to friends who are interested in history. Every like, every comment, every share helps this channel grow, and as the channel grows, we can tell more stories. On this channel, we unearth unforgettable stories from the dusty pages of history. We introduce heroes, we tell of sacrifices, we carry the lessons of the past into the future. And every story comes to life because of you. As long as you keep watching, we'll keep telling. Salute to the heroes of the Alpine War. Salute to those who fought for humanity in the freezing mountains, in the midst of fire. Their courage is our inspiration. Their sacrifice is our freedom. See you in the next video. Don't forget history, because history is the most powerful teacher that shapes our future, and those who listen well to this teacher's lessons build a better future. Take good care of yourselves. See you soon. Goodbye.